The T-62 is a Soviet medium tank that was first introduced in 1961. As a further development of the T-55 series, the T-62 retained many similar design elements of its predecessor, including low profile and thick turret armor. In contrast with previous tanks, which were armed with rifled tank guns, the T-62 was the first production tank armed with a smoothbore tank gun that could fire APFSDS rounds at higher velocities. The American prototype T-95 medium tank was the first tank ever built with a smoothbore gun. While the T-62 became the standard tank in the Soviet arsenal, it did not fully replace the T-55 in export markets due to its higher manufacturing costs and maintenance requirements compared to its predecessor. Although it was followed by later models in successor states of the Soviet Union, the T-62 remained in reserve in the former USSR and in frontline use by other countries. Design features of the T-62 became standardized in subsequent Soviet and Russian mass-produced tanks. Development history. The initial requirements. By the late 1950s, Soviet commanders realized that the T-55's 100mm gun could not penetrate the frontal armor of newer Western tanks, such as the Centurion and M48 Patton, with standard armor-piercing shells. While 100mm high-explosive anti-tank, heat, ammunition could have done the job, they were much less accurate than APFSDS shells, and the relatively low flight velocity resulted in poorer accuracy if used on moving targets. It was decided to upgun the T-55 with a 115mm smoothbore gun, able to fire kinetic energy penetrator armor-piercing fin-stabilized discarding SABO, APFSDS, rounds. Trials showed that the T-55 was inherently unsuited to mount the larger weapon, and work began on a new tank. The bigger gun required a bigger turret and turret ring to absorb the higher recoil. This in turn necessitated a larger hull, as the T-55 hull was simply too small to accept the new turret. The T-62 thus took shape, marking an evolutionary improvement on the T-55.
Object 140. After delivery of the T-54 design, its lead designer Alexander Morozov turned his attention to a new design, the Object 430. Object 430 had a hull of welded rolled steel plates and a turret of cast and forged steel. The turret had 3-layer armor with an overall thickness of 185mm to 240mm. It was armed with the new 100mm D-54TS tank gun. During this period, simpler upgrades to the existing T-54 design were assigned to a young engineer, Leonid N. Kartsev, the head of the OKB 520 Design Bureau of Ural-Vagonzavod Factory, UVZ, in Nizhny Tagil. He had already led the development of the relatively minor upgrades to the T-54 that produced the T-54A, Object 137G, and T-54B, Object 137G2, and began the development of a more major update as the T-54M, Object 139. When the T-54M was abandoned, he and his design team started working on a new tank, called Object 140. The new tank had a suspension with 6 light road wheels made of aluminium. The turret was cast and armed with the same D-54TS tank gun and included the Molniya 2-plane stabilization system. The tank carried 50 rounds and was powered by a V36 diesel engine developed by engineer Artemyev. The engine was placed on the bottom of the hull, a solution that reduced the height of the engine compartment. The Object 140 weighed 37.6 tons. In 1957, Ural-Vagonzavod built 2 Object 140 prototypes, which were put on trials soon after. The trials showed that because of the complicated construction of many of the tank systems, Kartsev's tank would be expensive in serial production and hard to maintain. Forced to abandon the Object 140 project, Kartsev started working on yet another T-54 modernization, called the Object 155. This design was more similar to the original T-54, but incorporated one useful feature from the Object 140. The upper fuel tanks were fitted with mounts for tank gun ammunition. This increased the ammunition load carried by the tank to 45 rounds. T-62A, Object 165. At the end of 1958, Kartsev decided to modernize the Object 140 turret. He fitted it with a cartridge case ejector and mounted it onto a stretched T-55 chassis. He also considered that designs based on already produced vehicles had a higher chance of acceptance. The Object 140 turret diameter, bigger than the T-55 turret by 249 mm, made redesigning the central part of the hull necessary. Kartsev changed the arrangement of the torsion beams, which was necessary to keep the tank's weight balanced. The tank received the designation Object 165, and in November 1958 3 prototypes were built. In January 1962, the Object 165 was accepted for service under the name T-62A. In the same year, Factory No. 183 produced 5 tanks that were put into experimental service.
Object 166. While working on a new tank, Kartsev was looking for a more powerful tank gun. The 100mm D-10T and D-54 tank guns had a fierce opponent in the form of the British L-701 tank gun. The Soviets decided to recalibrate the already existing 100mm D-54 TS tank gun. The modifications done to the gun included removing the rifling of the gun, reducing the profile of the bullet chamber, removing the muzzle brake, lengthening the gun tube, adding an automatic cartridge case ejector, and adding a bore evacuator in the middle of the gun tube, as opposed to the D-45 TS tank gun, which had a bore evacuator in the base of the gun tube. The new 115mm tank gun was designated U-5 TS Moat Rapra. It was the first smoothbore tank gun. When it went into serial production, it received the designation 2A20. It was put in trials against the D-10 TS tank gun, which armed the T-54B as well as some T-55 and T-55A medium tanks. These trials showed that the undercaliber projectiles fired from the U-5 TS had a nearly 200 m/sec higher muzzle velocity. It became apparent that the maximum range of the new tank gun was almost double that of the D-10 TS. The only serious drawback of the U-5 TS tank gun was the fact that it was not as accurate as the D-10 TS, because of the lack of rifling. However, the greater range of the gun and its extremely high muzzle velocity made the poor accuracy less of an issue. The new U-5 TS smoothbore tank gun was fitted into the Object 140 turret at the end of 1960. The new tank received the designation Object 166. In 1960, both Object 165 and Object 166 prototypes passed their trials. The Ural-Vaganzavod was preparing to start serial production of the new tank, though the General Armour Directorate, GBTU, was paying much more attention to Morozov's Object 430, which was in development since early 1952. Morozov was supported by General Ustinov, who was in charge of the Soviet military industry at the time. He did not see it as necessary to produce the new tank from Ural-Vaganzavod, but soon the situation changed dramatically with the appearance of a new American main battle tank, the M60. In 1961, Soviet military intelligence discovered that Britain was working on a new main battle tank armed with a 120mm tank gun. Because of this, Marshal Vasily Chukhov, Commander-in-Chief of the Soviet Army's ground forces, demanded an explanation of the Kartsev's tanks case. At a conference of GBTU and the Soviet Ground Forces Committee, it became apparent that Morozov's Object 430 tank was only 10% better than the serial T-55. Because of this, Morozov's project was deemed a complete failure. Though the representatives of Kharkiv Morozov Machine Building Design Bureau disclosed their work on the improved Object 432, which would ultimately become the T-64, Chukhov demanded that production of the Object 166 medium tank be started immediately. The OKB 520 Design Bureau of Eurovagonzavod provided another design, the Objekt 167, which was the Objekt 166 with a new more powerful V26 engine using a charger, developing 700 horsepower, 522 kilowatts. Two prototypes were built in the middle of 1961 and passed the trials. This time the GBTU decided not to wait for the new medium tank to pass trials and sent the Objekt 166 into mass production in July 1961. The Objekt 165 also entered service in very small numbers, under the designation T-62A. Design. The T-62 has a typical tank layout, driver's compartment at the front, fighting compartment in the center and engine compartment in the rear. The four-man crew consists of the commander, driver, gunner, and loader. Although the T-62 is very similar to the T-55 and makes use of many of the same parts, there are some differences. These include the hull, which is a few centimeters longer and wider, the different road wheels, and differences in characteristic uneven gaps between road wheels. Unlike the T-54 and T-55 medium tanks, the gaps between the last three pairs of road wheels are larger than the rest. Armament. The armament consists of the 115mm U-5 TS Malat 2A20 Rapra smoothbore tank gun with a 2-axis meteor stabilizer and 7.62mm PKT coaxial general-purpose machine gun mounted on the right of the main gun. The 12.7mm DSHK 1938 of 46 anti-aircraft heavy machine gun is mounted on the loader's hatch. It was optional until 1972 when all newly built tanks were fitted with the AA heavy machine gun. The tank carries 40 rounds for the main gun. 4 rounds are placed in the turret, and the rest are stored in the back of the fighting compartment and in the front of the hull, to the right of the driver. It carries 2,500 rounds for the coaxial machine gun. All of the vehicle's armament is mounted in or on the round cast egg-shaped turret from the Objekt 140 prototype main battle tank, mounted over the third pair of road wheels. The T-62 was armed with the world's first smoothbore tank gun, giving it considerably greater muzzle velocity than the Western 90mm and 105mm tank guns of its time. It can fire BM-3 APFSDS, BK-4, BK-4M heat and of 18 Frag-HE rounds. The 115mm gun introduced the first successful APFSDS ammunition, albeit with a steel penetrator. A smoothbore gun allowed a significantly better performance, from 10% to 20%, over heat ammunition, which was considered the main ammunition type for fighting enemy armor at medium and long ranges. The gun can be elevated or depressed between -6 degrees and +16 degrees. It is reloaded manually and gets automatically reset to +3.5 degrees of elevation after it is fired if the stabilizer is enabled. Empty cartridges are automatically ejected outside the vehicle through a small hatch in the rear of the turret. The gun has a range of effective fire of about 4 kilometers during day conditions and 800 m, with the use of night vision equipment, at night. This tank was fitted with a Meteor 2-axis stabilizer. It allows the T-62 to aim and fire while moving. According to tests conducted by the U.S. Army, the Meteor gave the T-62 a first hit probability of 70% for a moving target at 1,000 meters, with the tank moving up to 20 kilometers per hour. This gave the tank a good advantage in dynamic battlefields and breakthrough operations, especially in Central Europe where most of tank battles would take place under the 1,500 meters range.
Mobility. The T-62 uses torsion bar suspension. It has 5 pairs of rubber-tired road wheels, a drive sprocket at the rear and idler at the front on each side, with no return rollers. The first and last road wheels each have a hydraulic shock absorber. The tank is powered by the V55 12-cylinder, 4-stroke 1-chamber, 38.88-liter water-cooled diesel engine, developing 581 horsepower, 433 kilowatts, at 2,000 RPM. This is the same engine as the one used in the T-55. Because the T-62 weighs more than the T-55, it is less maneuverable. Like the T-55, the T-62 has 3 external diesel fuel tanks on the right fender and a single auxiliary oil tank on the left fender. The tank carries 960 liters of fuel in its internal and external fuel tanks. 2 optional 200-liter drum-type fuel tanks can be fitted on the rear of the vehicle for an increased operational range.
Armor. The T-62 has 5% thicker armor on the front of the hull, 102 mm at 60 degrees, and 15% thicker armor on the front of the turret, 242 mm, than the T-54/T-55. The turret armor is 153 mm thick on the sides, 97 mm thick on the rear and 40 mm thick on the roof. The hull armor is 79 mm thick on the upper sides, 46 mm thick at 0 degrees on the rear and 20 mm thick on the bottom. Although the armor on the front of the hull is thicker than in the T-55, the lower side armor, 15 mm, and the roof armor, 31 mm, are actually thinner. Equipment. One of the many similarities between the T-54/T-55 and T-62 tanks is their ability to create a smoke screen by injecting diesel fuel into the exhaust system. Like the T-54 and T-55, the T-62 has an unditching beam mounted at the rear of the hull. The tank can be fitted with a thin snorkel for operational usage and a large diameter snorkel for training. The thin snorkel can be disassembled and carried in the back of the turret when not used. The commander's cupola is located on the left of the top of the turret. The loader has a single piece hatch located on the right side of the turret and further back than the commander's cupola. The loader's hatch has a periscope vision block that can be used to view the areas in front of and behind the vehicle. The commander's cupola has 4 periscopes, 2 are located in the hatch cover while the other 2 are located in the forward part of the cupola. The driver has a single piece hatch located on the left front of the vehicle, directly in front of the left side of the turret. The tank uses the same sights and vision devices as the T-55 except for the gunner, who received a new TSH-2B41 sight which has X4 or X7 magnification. It is mounted coaxially with an optic rangefinder. The gunner has 2 periscope vision blocks, one of which is used in conjunction with the main searchlight mounted coaxially on the right side of the main armament. There are 2 other smaller searchlights. One of these is used by the commander and is mounted on his cupola. The tank has 2 headlights on the right front of the vehicle, one of which is infrared while the other one is white. Curved handrails around the turret allow easier entry for the commander, the gunner, and the loader. They also help the infantry to mount and dismount the tank while performing a tank dant. The tank has a box-shaped radiation detector/actuator mounted on the right-hand side of the turret, behind the compressed air tanks. While the T-62 did not feature an automatic loader, as would become characteristic of later Soviet tanks, it had a unique ejection port built into the back of the turret, which would open as the main gun recoiled, ejecting spent shell casings outside. This was considered advantageous since the spent casings would otherwise clutter the floor of the tank and fill the interior with noxious burnt propellant fumes. There is a blower mounted in the rear of the turret, to the left of the spent cartridge ejection port. Limitations. The T-62 shares some of the T-55's limitations: a cramped crew compartment, limited depression of the main gun and vulnerable fuel and ammunition storage areas. Opening the ejection port under NBC, nuclear, biological, or chemical conditions would potentially expose the crew to contamination, but the danger is limited in time and the internal overpressure makes a penetration by external agents quite unlikely. Each time the gun is fired, the tube must go into detent for cartridge ejection, though the system can be deactivated, making this unnecessary or in case of facing an NBC environment. The T-62 maximum average rate of fire is limited to 8 rounds per minute, which falls behind the capabilities of Western 105mm gun-equipped tanks. It takes 20 seconds for the T-62's turret to rotate through a full 360 degrees, which is 5 seconds longer than the time needed by the USM-6001 Patton tank. The turret also cannot be traversed with the driver's hatch open. Although the tank commander may override the gunner and traverse the turret, he cannot fire the main gun from his position. He is also unable to override the gunner in the elevation of the main gun, causing target acquisition problems. The U.S. Army considered the T-62's gun more accurate than that of the M60A1 within 1,500 meters, but less accurate at greater ranges. To fire the 12.7mm anti-aircraft heavy machine gun, the loader must be partially exposed, making him vulnerable to suppressive fire, and he must leave his main gun loading duties unattended. The T-62 underperformed in export markets relative to the T-54/T-55 series for numerous reasons. First, the T-62 was more than twice the price of the T-55, and many Warsaw Pact nations passed on the new tank because they did not feel that the improvements inherent in it warranted the cost. Secondly, in 1968, a 100mm APFSDS tank shell capable of piercing Western armor was developed. Use of the shell made the T-55 gun almost as effective as the T-62's, undercutting the T-62's original selling point, a bigger, more powerful gun. Third, the T-62 was, according to Purritt, almost immediately surpassed on its introduction by the new Western MBTs, the Chieftain and M60. Finally, the T-62 could not keep up with the new Soviet BMP-1, the principal infantry fighting vehicle that the T-62 was supposed to accompany. All of these factors combined to ensure that long-term investment in the T-62 was not viable and a new Soviet MBT had to be developed.